for God's purpose for your life, you would find it in Jesus' invocation, telling us to go and make disciples. To make something, you have to know what it is. You have to define its identity. Making disciples of Jesus is no exception. The only way for us to make disciples, then, is to answer the prior question. What is the biblical identity of a disciple? When I say dog, I suspect that all of us have a ballpark image of a four-legged animal wagging its tail. But then I don't think that any two people have the same image of a dog in their minds. When I say a dog, I think the Lutherans imagine a German Shepherd. The Calvinists probably think of a Great Dane. The Baptists conjure up images of a Rottweiler. The Anglicans probably think of a Golden Retriever. And the Pentecostals have a cross of a Beagle and a Chihuahua. I think we all have different images of dogs in our minds. But then I think all of us pretty much know what passes for a canine. It gets a little bit harder if we're to compare a dog to other four-legged creatures with a tail. In order to distinguish a dog, we'd have to get at the essence of dogness. We'd have to establish the identity of a dog. And to determine an identity of something means to determine that which sets it apart from everything else. What's true of dogs, I think it's true of disciples. When I say a disciple of Jesus Christ, I think pretty much all of us have this vague idea that that's about somebody who's a follower of Jesus. But then I don't think that any two people have the same image of a disciple in their minds. If you were to look at the album of Christianity through the ages, you'd discover portraits as different as the ages which they represented. There were people who once thought a disciple is a monk in the desert, somebody working out the relationship with God in the solitude of the wilderness. Then there came ages when we thought of a disciple as a kind of a humanitarian helper, standing there in the throng of people and meeting their basic needs. Then came the portrait of a disciple as a theological scholar, somewhere in the library poring over lexicons and commentaries. And then there was a period of time where if you were to ask who a disciple is, you'd get a picture of a charismatic preacher, screaming and hollering from the pulpit. If you're to stand all these usual suspects in a lineup in order to pick which one would count as a genuine disciple of Jesus Christ, I think you'd go blind. There'd be no way to tell just by looking at the pictures, comparing images. I think the only way to get at the true identity of a disciple is to look into the Bible. If you were looking for the identity of Jesus' disciple in the Bible, you'd have to make it to the end of the 13th chapter of the Gospel of John. It is here, on his way to the cross, that Jesus defines his disciple to the people who have followed him for over 3 years. And speaking to them, he says that he's giving them a new command. That command is for them to love each other. And then he points to that which will distinguish them from all the other people around them. He says, by this people will know that you're my disciples, is when you love one another. So to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, you have to love people who are his followers. Well, I must admit that those words are a bit of an embarrassment. They're a bit of an embarrassment because with the whole world looking in, trying to see what's different about Jesus and his followers, I'd expect Jesus to, say something that would make a bigger impact, make bigger headlines. I would expect him, for instance, for him to say that that what really defines a disciple is our love for the people who are on the fringes of life. People out there somewhere who are destitute, out away from the public eye. And as much as the Bible tells us to go and love these people, it does not build identity of a disciple on that love. Perhaps, if not the people who are farthest away from us, he might have pointed to the people who are the most destitute people right before our eyes. People who are in the gutters of life. If we love them, that would distinguish us as disciples. But that's not what he says. We have to love these people, but that does not define our identity. Finally, I would think that the trump card in that would be the call for us to love the people who are most antagonistic towards us. The people who hate us, our enemies. But we're told to love our enemies, but that does not define our identity. Jesus says that what defines the identity of people who claim to be his disciples is their love for people who follow him. As disappointing as this sounds, I think it points to something about God's love that sets it apart from the kind of love that you find in the world in which we live. The first thing you notice is that when Jesus says for us to love one another, that will be the distinguishing mark of his disciple. He's calling us to love the people that we know. The people that we see from day to day, the people that we hear every day, the people that we get to touch, the people who are in our lives, the people we know. And I think that stands in great contrast to the love that permeates so much of our culture. Because that love, if you were to strip it down to its identity, it's nothing more but an infatuation with the figment of our imagination. That love is always this grand feeling that rises up in us toward an object that we can never quite touch, never quite take hold of. So in other words, the love that the world offers us in movies, in songs, always talks about that sentiment that rises in our hearts towards something that does not really exist. God's love, on the other hand, is the love that has to be directed not at the figment of our imagination, not at something we conjure up or imagine, but at the very people that we know. I think it's hard for us to do that. I think in the Church of Jesus Christ, we catch ourselves time and again falling for that sentiment of love that spills into our lives from the world. I think that's the attraction, for instance, of the short-term missions. It's a great movement now for people to set some money aside or get other people to give them money so they can go for a week or two to some exotic location. And then they promise to exuberantly love the people who are there. It's a whole movement. People love doing it because you take 2 weeks out of a year to go, pour yourself out on these people, the people that you don't know. And I think that's what makes it easy. Makes it easy to go to a location where you don't know the people. It's exotic, it's different. You get to spend 2 weeks living out that sentiment of love toward people that you probably will never see again and you'll never have in your life. It's fascinating that we've created whole organizations here in North America where you can go with your youth group from Chicago to Seattle for 2 weeks and from Seattle to Minneapolis for 2 weeks. I love the people who are there. But you're not quite as gung-ho about doing that back at home. The love that defines a disciple of Jesus Christ is the love not for people we don't know. It's a love for people we do know. And then if you look closer, you notice that it's not only the love of people whom we know, but it's the love of people who know us. Here comes the difficulty. The difficulty is in that It's difficult to love people we know, but it's even harder to love people who know us. Because wherever we go and when we get into relationships, we can dazzle people with our personality. Sometimes with some of our character for a few days, for a few weeks, maybe months. But eventually the bubble bursts and people find out who we are. Or maybe who we are not. And that's disappointing. It's disappointing because once people know who we are, it's so much harder now. Because we not only have to love people who often do not change, but we now realize that we have to change in order to love them, and that's difficult. That accounts for that propensity that we have to escape to bigger congregations, bigger groups of people, bigger churches. When I talk to people who have gone from small church to one of those bigger mega churches, they often say, we go because it's a good place to hide. You see, in that church, you show up on a Sunday, you have a few acquaintances, but you don't really have to make deep relationships because people then, you don't know people, but also you can hide. They don't get to know you. The love that defines a disciple of Jesus Christ, not only love of people that you know, but it's a challenge to love people that know you. And then there's that third element of Jesus' love, and that is that in calling us to love one another, Jesus is calling us to love the people that he called into our lives. Notice that he's saying these words that were command about love to people he called out of the world. In the group of Jesus' disciples, there are people who were ideological, like the conservatives and liberals today. They, in normal world, would be at each other's throats. There were people in that group whose personalities did not fit. There were people who did not get along. They are the kind of people that would not pick each other. They would not be friends in life, or were not for the call of Jesus Christ. So in that call, when Jesus calls us to love people and be defined by his love, he's calling us to love people we know and people who know us, but also love people that he called into our lives. We have this profound tendency to pick the crowd we like. There's a new movement in the church, at least in the West, toward the home church. I think the idea of a home church is this sentimental ideal that's going to be like the church in the first century where people met in homes. The reason often they met in homes because there was no other place to meet. It was there or by the river. But I think that the propensity for us to try to create these home churches is because we're disappointed with people in the bigger congregations. There's always a person or two that rub us the wrong way. So we finally come to the place where we just would like to be by ourselves with 2 or 3 of the people we like. So we baptize the concept, sanctify it, and call it home church. And then from Sunday to Sunday we make coffee and tea and we put out cookies and we spend an hour or 2 with the people we like. But Jesus didn't call us to love people we like. He called us to love people he called into our lives. And that's what makes this love of Jesus so different from anything that you find in the world around us. There's something about this love that's profoundly ordinary. You know, while the love that we conjure up, the love that we imagine, that sentimental love that we hear in songs and we watch in movies, always sort of lifts our spirits and makes us imagine this other world. The love that God calls us to is ruggedly embedded in everyday reality. In that sense, it's just ordinary love. But then you realize that for this ordinary love, you need extraordinary source. Because you can't love people like that, the people who are in your life. That's the hardest thing, I think, that we get to do this side of eternity, is to actually spend our lives on the people we know, people who know us, people that God put in our lives. So we need an extraordinary source for this love. And that's why when Jesus tells his disciples to go and love one another, he tells them to go and love one another just as he has loved them. It's because God has chosen to love us that we can love others. There's more to it. It's because our God is love, that we have a source, inexhaustible source of love that overflows into our lives so we can keep giving and giving and giving. Because that's what defines God's love. God loves always gives, while the love that the world offers always takes. And it's not that the people who live without God in the world don't want to give love. They do. They want to give all that they can, but once they spend themselves on trying to do the best for the other person, they find themselves bankrupt, unable to come up with more. And so then they want to get more to refill whatever void fills their lives. But then they meet the people on the other side of the equation who are just as empty as they are. And so offering each other love is like two bankrupt people trying to start a business. You just can't do it. That's why the only way to love, you have to have a source, inexhaustible source, inextinguishable source of love that overflows into your life so that you can keep loving because you are loved by God who is love. That means that anybody who claims to be a disciple of Jesus Christ must erase from his vocabulary the question, what's in it for me? It doesn't happen as much now, but for years, after the Sunday morning services, there were visitors who would take me aside. They pulled me aside and they, with all the sanctimony of informed consumers, they would ask me, Pastor, what do you have to offer us in your church? When I first started as a young pastor, I felt being caught in the vice. On the one hand, there was that pressure coming from the gurus of church growth who were telling us that we need to meet people's felt needs. They pointed to the big 5,000, 10,000 people churches and said that it was my responsibility to answer that question with all the positive answers I could, or else people would walk down the road and look for answer in other churches. If I wanted to keep them, I had to give them something that they wanted. On the other hand, I felt the squeeze of the pressure from the leadership team. As a young pastor, they were looking for performance. Somebody warned me once that we must not do anything to offend, as he called it, the giving constituency. What he meant by it was that as long as there's more people coming, there's more money in the bank, we'll be fine. So standing there before the question, what do you have to offer us in your church? I wanted to come up with the best answer possible. I told them that we're creating programs, that we had some fine people, some grand ideas. But I discovered something. I noticed that the people who came, whose lives were built on the question, what's in it for me, would stay for several weeks, sometimes months, sometimes even years. But then they would come a Sunday when they did not get what they liked, did not get what they wanted, and they walk away. And I never saw them again. And so I turned the tables on the inquirers. For years, when people took me aside and stood me before that question, what do you have to offer us in your church? I said to them, what we have to offer you here is blood, sweat, and tears, and an opportunity to love people who will most likely never love you in return. They would look at me like I was mad and walk out the door all disappointed. And I must confess that I wished for that swinging door to hit them on the way out, so maybe knock some sense into them. And I thought that it's the problem of the people out there. They just don't know any better. You know, they become Christians, they sit in the pews, they put in their months and years, but they never really learn. But then I noticed it's not the problem just of people in the pews, it's the problem of people in the pulpit. There was one couple that came to a church that comes to mind. They came in, and on the first Sunday, he did not fail to give me the long run of his resume as leader in the church. He said he was a leader in the church. He helped the church finances. He led Bible studies. And then he regularly preached in the church over on the mainland. His wife had gifts in music. And being a small congregation, I thought what a great fit it would be for these people, these tremendous gifts, to enrich us with their presence. Then a couple of months down the road, through the grapevine of his friends, he passed on the information to me that he thought that he should be receiving a little bit more attention from the pastor and the leadership and the people. Wanted just a little bit more. 2 months later, they were gone. They were gone for a while, and then one Sunday they again graced us on Sunday morning with their presence, and I asked for his audience. In my study, I asked him to tell me on what basis he decided that they would leave our church and become part of another church down the road. And he said to me, we've decided on that church because they read from the Bible translation that we like. They sing the hymns that we're used to. The service, all the elements of the service are something we're comfortable with. And the people in leadership, the people in that church have given us a little bit more attention. And I sat there stunned for a while. And I said to him, look, I don't mean disrespect, and I don't mean to insult you. You're about the age of my father. But as much as you profess to be a Christian, you're actually a practicing pagan. Your whole life turns on the question, what's in it for me? And that's the question that has no place in the vocabulary of somebody who claims to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. That's because God's love always gives. Doesn't ask for anything in return. And if you look a little bit closer at that which God's love offers us, it gives us what you will not find on this side of eternity, outside of a relationship with God. What defines God's love, what God's love gives us in our lives, is grace and faithfulness. Grace never says never. Faithfulness always says always. The love that defines a disciple of Jesus Christ, God's love, is marked by grace because it comes with no strings attached. That means that if you're a disciple of Jesus Christ, you cannot take grace from God and fail to offer it to people in your life. God offers us His love not because of something in us, not because of anything we can offer Him, but precisely in spite of who we are. So it's a great tragedy when you look at the survey of the church in the West, for instance, and notice a divorce rate among people who claim to be disciples of Jesus Christ. To divorce somebody, you come to the place when you say, no more, never again. That's one too many disappointments. So, as the church is collapsing under the weight of broken relationships, people who claim to be Jesus' disciples take what they don't deserve from God, but they fail to offer it to people who have disappointed them in life. A disciple of Jesus is marked by love, and that love comes with grace, no strings attached. Then on the other side of that is that mark of faithfulness that comes with God's love. And faithfulness, in contrast to grace, which offers us that which we do not deserve. Faithfulness comes into our lives with no expiry date. It doesn't say, I love you until, but it tells you that it will always love you. That's because God's love is like that. When God chose to love us, it wasn't for a day or a week. It wasn't until we failed or did not fail. It's a love that promises to love us for all eternity. That means that there is no place in our lives when we can, at some point, decide we can walk away from people in our lives. And yet look what goes on in our churches. Right now we have about 30,000 denominations according to someone's count, and we're creating new denominations every week. Where people who get disappointed with other people pick up and go. Look at the revolving door of our communities, when people go from church to church to church to church, and then when they get tired they start new churches. They come to the place when they simply think they've had enough, so they think they have the right to walk away from other people. There was somebody who was walking out of the church of our door after years here. It's a tremendous disappointment to all of us. We asked for the biblical foundation for it, and the person had none other than just a disappointment of not getting what he wanted. But then on the way out, he said that we should read that book by, I think, Howard Hendricks, Exit Interviews. That's a book that's compiled from interviews with people who have been disappointed with the church not meeting their needs. And often you find that disappointment in relationships within the Church of Jesus Christ. But over the years I thought that somebody ought to finally write a book, No Exit Interviews. Somebody ought to write that book, because it seems to me that the Church of Jesus Christ lives not by the people who come through revolving door and grace congregations for a day or a year, but it lives through faithfulness of people who never quit on other people. And while people come, they love them to life, and then people leave them in a mess, and yet they have every reason to leave, but they stay. Somebody ought to interview them and write a book, No Exit Interviews. But then perhaps that book will have a single chorus running through it. The reason why these people never leave, they never exit, it's because they're constrained by the love of God. By the love of God, who loved them in spite of who they are, and decided to love them for all eternity. And it's that love that has gripped them so much that they want to love people to life. So if you are looking for God's purpose for your life, it's still the same. Make disciples of Jesus Christ. And the identity of a disciple still has not changed as much as, well, we watch so much of disappointment and carnage in the church. That identity is still marked by our love for people who follow Jesus. And that love never demands anything from anyone. It never stops giving God's best to everyone.